A retired pilot boards a routine flight as just another passenger until the plane starts failing midair. The crew dismisses him, the captain won't listen, and time is running out. When the engines begin to fail, will they realize the only man who can save them is sitting in seat 32B? Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Theo Braxton adjusted the strap of his carry-on bag as he stepped into the bustling terminal of JFK Airport. The air smelled of coffee, jet fuel, and the unmistakable blend of excitement and impatience that filled every airport. People rushed past him, some dragging oversized suitcases, others clutching boarding passes like their lives depended on it. For Theo, airports had always felt like second nature, a place where he belonged. But not today. Today, he was just another passenger. He walked steadily toward the security checkpoint, his posture straight despite the years that had settled into his bones. At 65, Theo had seen more skies than most people could imagine. 3 decades as a commercial pilot after serving in the Air Force had carved a lifetime of experience into him. He had navigated storms, turbulence, and mechanical failures, situations that would send most pilots into a cold sweat. But today, none of that mattered. He handed his boarding pass to a young woman at the counter. She barely looked at him before scanning it. "Economy," she mumbled, pointing toward the long line of passengers waiting to pass through security. Theo nodded, used to the casual dismissal. He stepped forward, unzipping his jacket as he reached the conveyor belt. A businessman behind him, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and an expensive-looking watch, sighed impatiently. "Excuse me, sir. Could you move a little faster?" the man said, his voice edged with annoyance. Theo glanced at him but said nothing. He dealt with men like this his whole life, people who assumed their time was more valuable than his. Instead of responding, he carefully placed his bag on the belt and stepped through the scanner. Minutes later, he was making his way toward his gate, passing rows of passengers waiting to board. A family struggled with a toddler, a group of teenagers huddled around a phone, laughing at something on the screen. It was an ordinary scene, but Theo felt something unusual. He didn't belong here. Not because he wasn't supposed to be on this flight. He had his ticket, his itinerary. But for decades, he had been the one in the cockpit, the one ensuring everyone else arrived safely. Now he was just another name on the manifest, another seat number. The thought unsettled him more than he expected. At the gate, the overhead speaker crackled to life. "Flight 1623 to Los Angeles is now boarding." Theo adjusted his bag and stepped into the line. As he handed over his boarding pass, a flight attendant glanced at it before giving him a brief, polite smile. "32B. Right this way," she said. Her tone was neutral, but something in her eyes flickered. She had assumed, without checking, that he belonged in economy. It wasn't the first time. Theo didn't react. He simply nodded and made his way down the jet bridge, stepping onto the aircraft. The cabin was already filling up, the overhead bins rapidly running out of space. He slid into his seat, placing his bag neatly at his feet. As he fastened his seatbelt, he let out a slow breath and stared out the window. This was just a flight, a simple trip to Los Angeles, nothing more. The hum of the aircraft filled the cabin as passengers settled into their seats. Overhead compartments slammed shut. Flight attendants maneuvered through the narrow aisle, checking seatbelts and making last-minute arrangements. Theodore Braxton sat quietly in his seat, hands resting on his lap, his gaze fixed on the window. Outside, the tarmac stretched toward the horizon, dotted with baggage carts and ground crew preparing for departure. A voice cut through the steady murmur of the cabin. "Excuse me, miss." Theo turned slightly, noticing the man seated beside him, a well-dressed businessman with graying temples and a sleek leather briefcase. The same man from security. "Is there any chance I could be moved to another seat? Maybe one with a little more space?" The businessman's voice was smooth, casual, but the glance he threw at Theo was unmistakable. The young flight attendant, a blonde woman with a professional smile pinned to her face, hesitated. "I'm sorry, sir, but we have a full flight today," she said. The businessman sighed, shifting in his seat as if the very idea of sharing space with Theo was an inconvenience. "Never mind," he muttered under his breath, clicking open his briefcase with exaggerated frustration. Theo didn't react. He had learned over the years that silence could be more powerful than words. As the pre-flight announcements began, Theo reached into his bag and pulled out a well-worn book, one he had carried with him for years. The cover was slightly faded, but the title was still legible: Flight Dynamics and Emergency Protocols. He flipped it open, his fingers tracing familiar words. Flying had been his life. Every maneuver, every calculation, every instinct, he had spent decades mastering them. Even though he was retired, the knowledge still lived within him, as natural as breathing. A chuckle from across the aisle pulled him from his thoughts. "You into aviation?" Theo glanced up. A young male flight attendant had stopped beside his row, a slight smirk playing at his lips. He nodded toward the book in Theo's hands. Theo met his gaze evenly. "You could say that." The attendant laughed, shaking his head. "Man, I love when people get all into planes. My uncle reads those war pilot books, thinks he could fly a jet if he had to." He nudged Amelia Crowley, the blonde flight attendant standing nearby. "Hey, check it out. We got a future pilot in 32B. Amelia barely glanced up, preoccupied with adjusting the overhead compartments. "Uh-huh." The young attendant grinned. "You ever thought about getting your pilot's license?" Theo looked at him for a long moment. "I had one. For over 40 years. The attendant's smirk faltered. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but hesitated. "Sir, Before he could finish, another voice cut in. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." The intercom crackled as the voice of Captain Lucas Wentworth filled the cabin. It was steady, confident, carrying the assured tone of someone who had spent years behind the controls. "We're looking at a smooth flight today, with a slight chance of turbulence as we cross into the Midwest. We'll be pushing back shortly, so sit back, relax, and enjoy your flight with us." Theo listened, his eyes narrowing slightly. He had heard that tone before, the polished confidence of a pilot who had never faced real adversity in the air. A few minutes later, Captain Wentworth and his co-pilot emerged from the cockpit, doing a routine walk through the cabin. It was standard procedure, a chance for the flight crew to be seen by passengers, to exude a sense of authority. As they passed Theo's row, Wentworth barely spared him a glance. But his co-pilot, a younger man with sharp eyes, paused. His gaze flicked to the book in Theo's hands, then back to his face. "You a pilot?" Theo closed the book, nodding once. "Used to be." The co-pilot raised an eyebrow. "Military? Air Force, then commercial. Retired now." Captain Wentworth, who had stopped a few seats ahead, turned slightly, finally giving Theo a proper look. There was something in his expression, mild surprise, but also something else, something dismissive. "Hell of a career," the co-pilot said, sounding genuinely interested. Wentworth, however, merely nodded and said, "Well, enjoy your flight," before turning away, leading the way back to the cockpit. Theo had seen that look before, too. The seatbelt sign dinged on. The engines roared to life. The plane began its slow, steady taxi toward the runway. The plane rumbled as it picked up speed, rolling down the runway in a controlled surge of power. Theodore Braxton kept his gaze steady on the window, watching as the cityscape of New York faded beneath them. It was an old habit, observing takeoffs, measuring the climb, feeling the subtle shifts in speed and pressure. Even after decades in the cockpit, the sensation never lost its pull on him. As they ascended, the aircraft gently leveled out, and the hum of the engines settled into a steady rhythm. The fastened seatbelt sign flickered off, followed by the standard chime. Around him, passengers unbuckled, shifting in their seats, stretching their legs. A few murmurs of relief filled the cabin. Across the aisle, the businessman, Daniel McCullen, scrolled through his phone with the detached air of someone who considered air travel a tedious necessity. He hadn't spoken to Theo since his failed attempt to switch seats. A few rows up, Amelia Crowley moved through the aisle, checking on passengers. When she reached Theo's row, she hesitated, just a fraction of a second, before speaking. "Can I get you anything, sir?" Her voice was polite but distant. "Water would be fine," Theo said. She nodded and disappeared toward the galley. Theo glanced at the small screen embedded in the seat back in front of him. It displayed a simplified flight path, New York to Los Angeles, a smooth arc across the country. But his eyes weren't on the destination. He focused on the projected weather system displayed in the corner of the screen. Storm activity. It wasn't unexpected. Summer flights often meant unpredictable air pockets, shifting pressure zones, and the occasional cluster of thunderstorms. Most pilots planned around them, adjusting altitude and trajectory to minimize discomfort. He knew what to look for: the way the wind patterns shifted, the warning signs embedded in radar reports. And right now, something didn't sit right. The flight path projected a slight deviation, a minor correction in the route, likely an attempt to avoid turbulence. But it wasn't enough. Amelia returned with his water, placing it on his tray table. Theo reached for it, but before he could take a sip, the plane gave a sudden, unexpected jolt. A few passengers gasped. Overhead bins rattled. The lights flickered, just for a second. Amelia instinctively grabbed the seat in front of her for balance. Theo placed his water back down. "That normal?" Daniel McCullen muttered, gripping his armrest. "Bit of turbulence," Amelia said, regaining her composure. "Nothing to worry about." Theo said nothing. He didn't want to alarm anyone. But turbulence wasn't just about sudden drops or shakes. It was about patterns. And that jolt hadn't been part of any normal pattern. In the cockpit, Captain Lucas Wentworth furrowed his brow as the plane hit another pocket of rough air. He exchanged a glance with his co-pilot, whose fingers hovered over the weather radar. "Looks like we're skirting the edge of a system," the co-pilot said. "Should smooth out in a bit." Wentworth exhaled sharply. "We're staying the course. Nothing we haven't handled before." His confidence was unwavering, unshaken. And that was the problem. Back in the cabins, Theo let his fingers rest lightly on the armrest, feeling the way the aircraft responded to the air currents. He had been through worse, much worse, but something told him this was far from over. The plane lurched again, more violently this time. Gas rippled through the cabin as overhead compartments rattled, a few loose items sliding across tray tables. Amelia Crowley, who had just finished serving drinks in the row ahead, grabbed onto a seat back to steady herself. Theo Braxton didn't flinch. His grip on the armrest remained loose, his face calm, but his mind was working, processing, analyzing, piecing together the unseen puzzle outside the aircraft. He had spent years reading the sky like an open book, and this chapter wasn't looking good. Across the aisle, Daniel McCullen had abandoned his phone, his knuckles white against the armrest. "This isn't normal turbulence," he muttered, mostly to himself. Theo agreed, but he kept that to himself. No point in spooking a businessman who already looked like he regretted getting on this flight. In the cockpit, Captain Lucas Wentworth furrowed his brow as another warning light blinked to life. "Pressure drop in the left engine," the co-pilot said, his voice a little too tight. Wentworth exhaled through his nose. "It's an older system. Sometimes these sensors throw false alarms." He flipped a switch, resetting the alert. "We'll monitor it, but I don't want to startle the passengers over nothing." His co-pilot hesitated but nodded. Outside, the sky was darkening. The scattered clouds below were thickening into something heavier, angrier. Back in the cabin, Amelia walked briskly toward the front, disappearing behind the curtain that separated the galley from the passenger area. A moment later, she re-emerged and moved toward Theo's row. He saw it before she even spoke, the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "Sir," she said carefully, "you said earlier that you used to fly?" Theo closed his book and looked up at her. "That's right," she swallowed. "Military?" He nodded. "Then commercial for 30 years. Amelia hesitated, shifting on her feet. "I don't mean to intrude, but does this turbulence feel off to you?" Theo studied her for a second. She was young, but she wasn't green. She knew enough to trust her instincts. "Yes," he said simply. Amelia exhaled, her fingers tightening around the edge of the seat. "I thought so." She glanced toward the cockpit. "Captain Wentworth seems confident. Says it'll pass." Theo followed her gaze. "Confidence isn't the same as experience," he said. A beat of silence. Then, the plane dropped. A full second of weightlessness. Passengers screamed as cups and loose objects lifted off tray tables before slamming back down. Theo instinctively braced himself, feet planted firmly on the floor. Somewhere up front, a flight attendant yelped as she lost her balance. McCullen cursed under his breath, his breathing quick and shallow. "Tell me that's normal." Theo didn't answer, because it wasn't. Amelia rushed toward the intercom and pressed the button. "Captain, we just had a severe I know, Wentworth's voice came through, clipped and impatient. I've got it under control. Theo heard the strain beneath the words. Amelia did too. The flight attendants hurried down the aisle, checking for injuries, reassuring passengers who were visibly shaken. Overhead compartments had popped open, and a few bags teetered precariously on the edge. Theo could feel it now. Something was shifting in the airflow, something deeper than just bad weather. He had felt this kind of instability before, and it had never ended well. He turned his head slightly, just enough for Amelia to hear him. You should tell him to check the left engine. Amelia hesitated, then nodded. She disappeared toward the cockpit. A moment later, a crackle came over the speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking, Wentworth announced, his voice smooth but forced. We've encountered unexpected turbulence, but there's nothing to be alarmed about. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Theo knew what that was. A pilot's way of saying, I hope you don't notice something's wrong. He kept his eyes on the window, watching the sky churn. Something was definitely wrong. The uneasy hum of murmured voices filled the cabin as passengers glanced around, searching for reassurance that no one could offer. The plane had settled for now, but the atmosphere remained tense, the air thick with unspoken fear. Theodore Braxton sat still, his fingers lightly tapping against the armrest. It was a habit from his flying days, measuring time, feeling the pulse of the aircraft, sensing what was coming before the instruments confirmed it. Across the aisle, Daniel McCullen was gripping his armrest so tightly his knuckles had turned pale. I don't like this, he muttered, half to himself, half to no one. Theo glanced at him. Planes don't just drop like that unless there's something more going on. McCullen looked at him sharply. That's supposed to make me feel better? Theo didn't answer. Up front, Amelia Crowley emerged from behind the cockpit door, her face carefully composed, but Theo caught the tightness in her shoulders. She moved briskly down the aisle, stopping just long enough to check on passengers. But when she reached Theo's row, she paused. She knelt slightly, lowering her voice. Captain Wentworth said the turbulence was worse than expected, but he's still insisting everything is under control. Theo studied her expression. She wanted to believe it. She didn't. What did he say about the left engine? Theo asked. Amelia hesitated. He told me not to worry about it. Theo let out a slow breath. That was a problem. Any pilot worth their salt would have double-checked an engine alert, even if they thought it was a false reading. Wentworth wasn't even entertaining the idea. A sudden shift in the airframe made Amelia glance toward the front. I don't know if I should... Theo cut in. How long have you been flying? 6 years. You trust your instincts? She hesitated, then nodded. Then don't ignore them, Theo said. Before she could respond, a new sound rippled through the cabin, a faint, unsettling whine, somewhere beneath them. It was subtle, almost imperceptible over the hum of the engines. But Theo heard it. So did Amelia. She shot him a quick look before rising to her feet, moving swiftly back toward the cockpit. McCullen let out a strained laugh. So, former pilot, huh? Theo turned toward him. That's right. McCullen exhaled through his nose. Great. So tell me, what happens if one of these engines does fail? Theo didn't sugarcoat it. Depends on how bad the failure is. If it's just a partial loss of power, they compensate with the other engine and adjust flight patterns. If it's a full failure, they have to prepare for an emergency landing. McCullen didn't look reassured. And if the pilot doesn't believe anything's wrong? Theo held his gaze. Then we've got a different kind of problem. The cabin lights flickered once, just for a second. Theo knew that wasn't a coincidence. The cabin lights steadied, but the unease they left behind didn't fade. The atmosphere inside the plane had shifted, not in the way turbulence made passengers momentarily alert before they settled back into their routines. This was different. Even those who weren't paying attention before had started to pick up on it. Theo Braxton felt it too. It wasn't just the flicker of the lights, it was the way the aircraft handled, the barely noticeable but persistent strain in the engine's vibration, the subtle shifts in air pressure. Something was wrong. Across the aisle, Daniel McCullen had abandoned all pretense of calm. He let out a short, humorless laugh. So tell me, do I have reason to be worried, or am I just being paranoid? Theo didn't answer right away. His focus remained on the slight adjustments he could feel in the plane's movement, the way the engines weren't maintaining their usual balance, the faintest dip in power every few minutes. "It's not paranoia," Theo said finally. McCullen exhaled sharply. "Fantastic." A few rows ahead, Amelia Crowley reemerged from the cockpit. She was walking fast, her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't slow as she passed Theo's row, but the look she gave him was enough. The pilot wasn't listening. Theo sighed. He had hoped Wentworth would at least check the issue properly. Instead, he was doubling down. Amelia reached the galley, whispering something quickly to another flight attendant. Then she turned back toward the passengers, her expression shifting into forced composure. But before she could take another step, the plane jolted. Not a gentle sway, not a mild bump, a sharp, aggressive lurch. The nose of the aircraft dipped, sending a ripple of gasps through the cabin. A tray of drinks in the galley tipped over, sending cups of water cascading onto the floor. Theo gripped the armrests, not in fear, but in calculation. That drop wasn't turbulence. That was power loss. And now everyone knew something was wrong. A woman 2 rows up let out a nervous laugh. That was... Another sudden jerk cut her off. Overhead compartments rattled. A few overhead bin doors popped open, and a bag fell, hitting the floor with a dull thud. A baby in the back of the cabin started wailing. McCullen turned to Theo, his voice tight. "I don't suppose you have a good explanation for that?" Theo's jaw tightened. "I do, but you won't like it." The intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." Wentworth's voice was still composed, but there was a sharpness to it now, an edge that wasn't there before. "We've encountered an unexpected wind shear. I need everyone to remain seated with their seatbelts fastened. There's nothing to be concerned about. We're adjusting our altitude to a more stable level." Theo exhaled through his nose. Wind shear? That was the best excuse he could come up with? This wasn't weather-related. This was mechanical. McCullen scoffed. "Oh, yeah. Nothing to be concerned about." "Right." Theo barely heard him. His mind was moving too fast, running through scenarios. If it was what he suspected, if they were losing power in the left engine, then Wentworth had to acknowledge it. He had to. And if he didn't... Theo glanced toward the cockpit. Amelia was already looking at him. She wasn't convinced either. And in her eyes, Theo saw something else. A silent question. What do we do? The cabin felt heavier now. Not just from the altitude, not just from the tension. Something more. A weight in the air that pressed down on everyone. A collective realization creeping through the passengers. Something was wrong. Theo Braxton had seen this kind of denial before. He had flown with pilots who ignored warning signs, convinced they had everything under control, until they didn't. The difference between a great pilot and a reckless one wasn't skill. It was knowing when to admit you needed to change course. Lucas Wentworth wasn't that kind of pilot. Another shudder rippled through the aircraft, subtle but distinct. The engines were struggling to compensate. Theo could feel the imbalance now, how the left side of the plane wasn't carrying its full weight. McCullen let out a slow breath. "Okay, that's the third one. I count 3 drops in, 15 minutes? Theo nodded slightly. "Maybe less." McCullen clenched his jaw. "If this plane lands in one piece, I'm demanding a refund." Theo turned his focus back to Amelia. She was standing near the galley now, speaking in hushed tones with another flight attendant. The tension in her shoulders was impossible to miss. Then, without hesitation, she moved, straight to the cockpit. The door closed behind her, but Theo didn't need to hear the conversation to know how it was going. He knew exactly how it would play out. She'd voice her concern. Wentworth would dismiss it, and the problem wouldn't go away. Sure enough, less than a minute later, the intercom clicked on again. "This is your captain speaking. We are currently experiencing some unexpected turbulence, but I want to assure you that everything is under control. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Theo shook his head. It was always the same. The moment a pilot felt their authority questioned, they doubled down. It wasn't about safety anymore. It was about pride. The lights flickered again, barely noticeable, but Theo caught it. He wasn't the only one. A man in the row behind him muttered, "Yeah, I feel really reassured." McCullen exhaled. Braxton, you flew for 30 years. If you were up there, would you still be telling people to sit tight? No, Theo said. I'd be preparing for an emergency landing. McCullen didn't respond right away. He stared at Theo, as if hoping he'd take it back, say something less ominous. But Theo didn't. And then, the plane dropped. Hard. Passengers screamed as the sudden freefall yanked them against their seatbelts. Trays slammed against armrests. A soda can shot into the air before crashing back down onto someone's lap. Theo felt the loss of altitude before the altimeter on the seat screen confirmed it. McCullen cursed. What the? The plane steadied, but the damage was done. People were no longer just nervous. They were terrified. And Theo? He had seen enough. He unbuckled his seatbelt. McCullen's eyes widened. What the hell are you doing? Theo looked at him. Getting this plane on the ground in one piece. Theo Braxton rose from his seat, steadying himself against the mild but persistent tremor running through the aircraft. A few passengers nearby glanced at him, their eyes full of nervous curiosity. No one said anything. Not yet. Across the aisle, Daniel McCullen looked at him like he'd lost his mind. You can't just walk up there and take control of the plane. Theo met his gaze. Watch me. McCullen let out a sharp laugh, more from disbelief than amusement. Jesus, and here I thought I was the crazy one on this flight. Ignoring him, Theo moved toward the front of the cabin. Each step was firm, deliberate, a silent challenge to anyone who might think of stopping him. A flight attendant started to say something, but Amelia Crowley stepped into view just in time. She looked pale. That told Theo all he needed to know. They locked eyes. We need to talk, she said under her breath. Theo nodded. Yeah, we do. She motioned for him to follow her toward the galley, away from the eyes and ears of the passengers. As soon as they were behind the curtain, her professional composure cracked just slightly. The left engine is failing, she whispered. I don't care what Wentworth says. We're losing power. Theo exhaled through his nose. He had suspected it, but hearing it confirmed sent a fresh wave of urgency through him. He's not acknowledging it? He's refusing to acknowledge it. Amelia's jaw tightened. I tried, I really did. He just keeps repeating that he has it under control. Theo let out a slow breath. Did he even run a full diagnostic? She hesitated. That was answer enough. Theo glanced toward the cockpit door. I need to get in there. Amelia's eyes flickered with hesitation. I can't just... Another sharp drop interrupted her. The plane lurched, and somewhere in the cabin, a woman let out a shriek. Overhead bins rattled violently. A water bottle rolled down the aisle, bouncing off someone's foot. Theo grabbed onto the wall to steady himself. That was not turbulence. It was the plane struggling to stay level. Amelia swallowed hard. Okay, she whispered. Come with me. She moved quickly, leading Theo toward the reinforced door. She knocked twice, then pressed the intercom button. Captain, I need to speak with you. A beat of silence. Then Wentworth's voice, tight, irritated. Now's not a good time, Crowley. This is urgent, she emphasized. I need to come in. Silence. Theo waited, feeling the second stretch. Then, the sound of the locking mechanism releasing. The door cracked open just enough for Amelia to slip inside. Theo followed. And then, the door shut behind him. Captain Lucas Wentworth turned in his seat, his expression immediately shifting from surprise to barely veiled hostility. The hell is he doing in here? Theo met his glare without hesitation. Saving your flight, Wentworth scoffed. You've got to be kidding me. Crowley, what the hell are you thinking? I'm thinking we're about to lose our left engine, she shot back. Theo stepped forward. You need to declare an emergency right now. Wentworth turned fully in his seat, face darkening. I don't take orders from a passenger. Theo's voice was steady, unwavering. And I don't take orders from a man about to crash his own plane. The co-pilot's head snapped toward them. Wait, crash? Theo ignored him, keeping his focus on Wentworth. You're losing altitude. Your left engine is running at reduced thrust, and it's only going to get worse. You know this isn't turbulence. Wentworth's jaw clenched. I have the situation under control. Theo's patience was wearing thin. He had dealt with men like this before, pilots who needed to be the smartest person in the room. The only difference was that this time, Hundreds of lives depended on getting through to him. Then prove it, Theo said. Run a diagnostic. Right now. Wentworth let out a bitter laugh. You think I need you to tell me how to run my aircraft? Theo didn't blink. I think if you actually knew how to run it, I wouldn't be standing here right now. That hit its mark. The cockpit went silent. The co-pilot hesitated, then cleared his throat. Maybe we should check the... Fine, Wentworth snapped. He turned back to his instruments, pressing a few buttons, keying in the system scan. The hum of the aircraft filled the silence as numbers and readings populated the screens. Theo watched. He already knew what was coming. And then, a warning alert blinked to life on the panel. Left engine, power loss detected. The co-pilot paled. Oh, shit! Theo crossed his arms. Told you. Wentworth stared at the screen, his jaw tight. Damn it! Theo leaned in. You're losing thrust. You need to descend and prepare for an emergency landing now, before we're out of options. Wentworth didn't respond right away. He stared at the flashing alert, the numbers shifting in front of him. And then, for the first time, Theo saw the recognition in his eyes, the realization that he was not in control anymore. Lucas Wentworth sat frozen in his seat, his fingers hovering over the control panel, the warning light blinking relentlessly in front of him. The cockpit was silent except for the steady hum of the engines, one of which was on the verge of failing completely. Theo Braxton stood firm behind him, arms crossed, waiting. You need to act now, Theo said, his voice calm but pressing. Wentworth didn't look at him. Instead, he exhaled sharply and shifted his focus back to the instruments. His jaw clenched so tightly it looked like it might snap. The tension in the air was thick, stretching between the two men like an unspoken challenge. The co-pilot, who had been quiet up until now, finally spoke up. Captain, he's right. His voice was hesitant, but there was no mistaking the urgency in it. We need to divert. Wentworth's fingers twitched against the throttle. His pride was fighting against reality, against the numbers flashing on the screen, against the simple truth that he was about to lose an engine mid-flight. Theo knew this moment well. He'd seen it before. A pilot's breaking point. And if Wentworth didn't break, if he didn't bend, this plane would. Theo, Amelia's voice came from behind him. She had stayed silent, watching, but now there was an unmistakable edge of fear creeping into her tone. Passengers are scared. They know something's wrong. Theo nodded, keeping his focus on Wentworth. Declare an emergency, Theo said again, slower this time. You need to get ahead of this. Another warning light flickered. The co-pilot cursed under his breath. Captain, we're dropping speed, he said quickly. If we don't descend now, we risk... I know what's happening, Wentworth snapped, his voice tight with frustration. Theo didn't flinch. He had already sized Wentworth up. He wasn't a bad pilot. He was just one who had never been tested like this, until now. You've got one shot to get this right, Theo said evenly. Do it before the plane makes the choice for you. Silence. And then, Wentworth exhaled, a slow, sharp breath. His fingers finally moved, flicking the radio switch. This is Flight 1623, he said into the mic, his voice steady, but not as self-assured as before. We are declaring an emergency. Repeat, declaring an emergency. Requesting immediate diversion to the nearest airport with an open runway. Theo let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The co-pilot immediately got to work, adjusting settings, checking emergency procedures. Amelia, standing behind Theo, let out a shaky exhale. Theo leaned slightly forward, watching as the captain inputted the new course. Where's our closest landing option? The co-pilot scanned the system. There's a regional airport in Arizona, about 120 miles ahead. They have a long enough runway for us. Theo nodded. Good, then let's get there in one piece. Wentworth didn't respond, but Theo could see the shift in his posture, the slight sag in his shoulders, the way his hands moved with more precision now. The fight was gone. He was finally focused on what mattered. Theo took a step back, glancing at Amelia. Go tell the passengers what they need to hear. They don't need the full truth, just enough to keep them calm. She nodded. I'm on it. As she left, Theo took one last look at Wentworth. Good call, he said simply. Wentworth didn't look up, but he gave the smallest of nods. It wasn't a win, not yet, but they were finally heading in the right direction, The intercom crackled as Amelia Crowley stepped up to address the cabin. The weight of the moment sat heavy on her shoulders. She wasn't just relaying a message. She was holding together a plane full of people who were already on the edge of panic. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice steady but warm, "we've encountered a mechanical issue, and as a precaution, we'll be making an unscheduled landing at a nearby airport. Our crew is fully prepared, and everything is under control. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened as we begin our descent." She kept it simple, reassuring, but she could see it in their eyes. They knew. People weren't dumb. They had felt the plane drop. They had seen the lights flicker, and now the flight attendants were moving faster, their smiles a little too forced. Across the aisle, Daniel McCullen had stopped trying to act indifferent. He looked at Theo Braxton, his fingers drumming anxiously against his armrest. "We're not gonna crash, right?" McCullen asked, his voice hushed. Theo kept his expression neutral. "Not if we do this right." McCullen let out a dry chuckle. "Hell of an answer." Theo didn't respond. His focus was still on the subtle shifts in the aircraft, the small adjustments the plane was making as Wentworth and his co-pilot guided it toward the emergency landing site. In the cockpit, Wentworth's hands were steady now, his face set in a deep frown of concentration. "How's the engine holding?" he asked. The co-pilot checked the readings. "We're still losing power, but we should make it." Should. That wasn't the kind of word you wanted to hear at 30,000 feet. Wentworth adjusted the throttle, preparing for the descent. "Let's get her down smooth." Back in the cabin, the tension was thick enough to choke on. Amelia moved from row to row, checking on passengers, offering reassuring nods. Theo felt the first shift in altitude. They were descending, but something felt off. The angle wasn't quite right. He could feel it in his bones. Then, a sudden shudder rattled through the aircraft. Not turbulence, not just a rough patch of air. Something mechanical. Amelia spun back toward the cockpit, her face pale. Theo unbuckled his seatbelt. "Where the hell are you going?" McCullen hissed. Theo didn't answer. He was already moving. Theo Braxton moved quickly down the aisle, steady despite the unstable hum of the aircraft around him. Every instinct in his body was screaming. Something wasn't right. The descent was wrong. The plane wasn't just lowering altitude, it was struggling against something. He reached the front of the cabin just as Amelia Crowley emerged from the cockpit, her face taut with worry. "Something's off," she whispered. Theo didn't hesitate. He stepped past her and through the cockpit door. Lucas Wentworth was gripping the controls tightly, his knuckles pale. The co-pilot was flipping switches frantically, his breathing uneven. "We've got a drag issue," the co-pilot said before Theo could even ask. "Left engine is losing power faster than we expected. We're getting resistance. She's pulling too hard to the left." Theo's stomach sank. That meant the engine wasn't just failing, it was dying. "You're not getting enough thrust from the right engine to compensate," Theo said. Wentworth didn't look at him. "I know," his voice was clipped, but there was no arrogance this time, just frustration. Theo stepped forward. "You need to adjust your descent angle. Right now, you're fighting the plane instead of letting it work with you." Wentworth shot him a glare, but it was fleeting. Because deep down, he knew Theo was right. The co-pilot spoke first. "He's right. If we keep trying to force the balance, we'll burn out what thrust we have left." Wentworth exhaled sharply. "Fine. Recalibrating." Theo watched as the captain adjusted the descent, shifting the nose of the plane just slightly. The plane shuddered, then steadied. Theo grabbed onto the back of the seat, watching the instruments. The pressure was still dropping, but slower now. That bought them minutes, not much more. Wentworth wiped his forehead. "We're still coming in too fast." Theo glanced at the screen. He was right. They were bleeding altitude, but they weren't slowing down the way they needed to. "We're too heavy," the co-pilot murmured. "If we don't slow down before landing, we'll come in too hard and overshoot the runway." Theo finished for him. A long silence. There was only one way to fix that. They had to dump fuel, and they had to do it now. The cockpit was eerily quiet except for the hum of the instruments and the steady beeping of the warning lights. The reality of their situation hung heavy in the air. They had one shot at this. Lucas Wentworth's fingers hovered over the controls, his jaw locked tight. Dumping fuel mid-descent is risky. Theo Braxton nodded. So is slamming into the runway at full speed. The co-pilot swallowed hard. If we don't lighten the load, we won't slow down in time. Theo leaned over slightly, eyes flicking to the calculations flashing on the screen. You don't need a full dump. You need just enough to balance out the drag from the engine loss. Wentworth exhaled sharply. He wasn't arguing anymore. He was listening. Without another word, he reached for the controls and toggled the fuel dump system. A soft whoosh vibrated through the plane as excess fuel was released. Theo watched the readouts. The numbers ticked downward. Come on! A slight shift in the aircraft's handling confirmed it. Lighter, smoother. The co-pilot's voice was tense. We're approaching final descent. 5 minutes out. Theo's grip tightened on the back of the seat. The airport was visible on the navigation screen now, a small dot growing larger as they closed in. But they weren't clear yet, not by a long shot. Back in the cabin, Amelia Crowley's voice carried through the intercom, steady despite the fear she had to be feeling. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now making our final approach. Please ensure your seatbelts are securely fastened and remain seated. Our crew is fully prepared, and we appreciate your cooperation. Theo had been on the other side of that announcement too many times to count. He knew what it didn't say. It didn't say brace for impact, but that's what she meant. Wentworth adjusted the flaps, scanning the runway ahead. We're still coming in fast. Theo saw it too. They had burned fuel. They had adjusted the descent angle, but they were still carrying more speed than they should be. And if they came in too fast, Theo grabbed the headset resting on the co-pilot's seat. Tower, this is Flight 1623. We need emergency response on standby. The air traffic controller's voice crackled through. Understood, Flight 1623. Runway is cleared for immediate landing. Fire and rescue are in position. Theo set the headset back down. He turned to Wentworth. It's all you now. Wentworth said nothing, but for the first time, Theo trusted him to get it done. The runway was getting closer. This was it. The runway was fast approaching, growing larger by the second as Flight 1623 hurtled toward it. The hum of the engines was uneven now, the struggling left engine barely holding on, while the right one carried most of the weight. The aircraft was still moving too fast. Theo Braxton braced himself behind the captain's seat, watching as Lucas Wentworth gripped the controls. His breathing was steady, but his knuckles were white. Flaps full, the co-pilot announced, his voice tight. Wentworth nodded, his focus locked on the runway. He toggled the final settings, lowering the landing gear. A warning light flashed. The co-pilot's stomach dropped. We've got a gear imbalance. Theo's eyes flicked to the screen. The left side landing gear was sluggish, deploying but slower than the right. They weren't coming in evenly. Stay on it, Theo said. Let it catch up. Wentworth clenched his jaw, adjusting the angle slightly. In the cabin, Amelia Crowley moved through the rows, ensuring passengers were strapped in. Brace position, she shouted, her voice firm. People obeyed immediately, some squeezing their eyes shut, others gripping the armrests with white-knuckled desperation. The ground rushed up to meet them. Wentworth exhaled sharply. Here we go. The wheels hit, hard. The entire plane jerked violently as the uneven gear deployment sent a shockwave through the fuselage. The right wheels connected first, slamming against the tarmac, while the left side lagged just a fraction of a second before making full contact. Passengers screamed as the plane tilted slightly, veering to the left. Theo felt the pull instantly. We're drifting, the co-pilot shouted. Wentworth reacted fast, gripping the rudder pedals to keep them aligned. The plane was fighting him, pulling against the uneven weight. Smoke curled from the tires as the aircraft skidded, the brakes groaning under the pressure. Come on, Wentworth growled, forcing the plane back in line. The speed dropped. The runway markers flew past. The engines roared. And then they stopped. The plane lurched to a final, jarring halt. For a second, no one moved. Silence. And then a collective exhale. Shaky breaths, sobbed prayers, gasps of disbelief. Theo let go of the back of the seat. His shoulders sagged slightly. They had made it. For a long moment, the only sound inside the aircraft was the tick of cooling metal and the heavy, uneven breathing of passengers who had just come face to face with the edge of disaster. Then, The first cheer erupted from somewhere in the back. A shaky, disbelieving laugh followed. And then all at once people realized they were alive. Applause spread through the cabin, a desperate release of tension. Relief rolling through the passengers like a wave. Some clung to each other, others wiped away silent tears. A man in business attire muttered a prayer under his breath, gripping his seatbelt like it had saved his life. Theo Braxton exhaled, stepping back from the cockpit and into the galley. Amelia Crowley was there, her hands still gripping the intercom panel, her shoulders shaking slightly. "We made it," she murmured, almost like she was trying to convince herself. Theo nodded. "Yeah, we did." Outside, emergency vehicles sped toward them, flashing lights reflecting off the tarmac. The rescue teams would be on board in minutes, assessing injuries, checking the fuselage for damage. Theo turned back toward the cockpit, where Lucas Wentworth still sat in the captain's chair, his hands resting loosely on the controls. The man looked like he had just aged 10 years in the span of one flight. His chest rose and fell in slow, measured breaths. Finally, he turned his head, locking eyes with Theo. For the first time since they had met, there was no arrogance, no dismissive scoff, only quiet acknowledgement. "I screwed up," Wentworth admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Theo didn't say anything at first. He didn't need to. The truth was right there, flashing on the instrument panel, etched into the scorched rubber of the tires, lingering in the ghost of the warning alarms that had nearly been ignored. "Yes," Theo finally said. "You did." Wentworth swallowed, his throat tight. "If you hadn't—" "Doesn't matter now," Theo interrupted. "The plane's on the ground. That's what matters." Wentworth gave a small nod, but Theo could see the weight of it sinking in. The co-pilot pulled off his headset, rubbing a hand down his face. "That was—" He let out a strained chuckle. "Hell of a flight." Theo turned to leave, but paused at the door, glancing back at Wentworth one last time. "I hope you learned something," Theo said. Wentworth didn't respond right away. He just looked down at the control panel, as if finally understanding what it meant to truly be responsible for every life on board. "I did," he murmured. Theo didn't wait for anything more. He stepped out of the cockpit as the rescue crews reached the aircraft, ready to take over. The emergency exit doors finally opened, and the first rush of fresh air filled the cabin. A mixture of relief and exhaustion washed over the passengers as they remained seated, waiting for further instructions. Outside, flashing emergency lights bounced off the plane's exterior, illuminating the faces of the rescue crew as they hurried toward the aircraft. Theo Braxton stood near the front, watching as Amelia Crowley moved through the aisle, helping passengers gather their things, reassuring them that everything was under control. She had done well, better than well. Under different circumstances, with a less capable crew, this could have ended very differently. "All right, folks, listen up," a rescue worker called out from the doorway. "We're going to begin deplaning row by row. Please remain seated until you're instructed to exit." Some passengers nodded eagerly, desperate to put solid ground beneath their feet. Others simply sat in stunned silence, as if still processing the fact that they had survived. Daniel McCullen, who had been oddly quiet since the landing, finally turned to Theo. His usual sharpness was gone, replaced by something almost respectful. "You knew," he said. "Back when this all started, you knew something wasn't right." Theo met his gaze. "Yeah." McCullen exhaled. "Hell of a way to prove a point." Theo gave a small, knowing nod. He wasn't looking for validation. He never had been. A few rows up, Amelia caught Theo's eye and gave him a nod of thanks before returning to assist an elderly couple. The line of passengers slowly shuffled forward as the first group was let off the plane. Rescue personnel checked in with each of them, scanning for injuries or signs of distress. Theo waited, letting others go ahead. He had no reason to rush. And then, a voice from behind. "Braxton." Theo turned. Lucas Wentworth stood in the cockpit doorway. His face was still pale, exhaustion weighing down his features. But there was something else in his expression, something unspoken, yet obvious. He walked over, stopping just a step away. The two men locked eyes. For a moment, Wentworth said nothing. Then finally, "Thank you." It wasn't just gratitude, it was admission. Theo studied him for a second, then nodded. Take care of your next flight, Captain. Wentworth swallowed, then gave a small nod in return. I will. Theo turned back toward the exit, stepping out of the cabin and into the cool, open air. The crisp night air hit Theo Braxton as he stepped off the aircraft and onto the tarmac. He rolled his shoulders, feeling the tension slowly unwind from his muscles. The runway was alive with flashing emergency lights, uniformed personnel moving quickly as they guided passengers away from the plane. People were still shaken, some crying, others clutching their loved ones in silent relief. But they were alive. That was what mattered. Theo took a few steps away, giving himself a moment to just breathe. He had spent his life ensuring people reached their destinations safely, and tonight, even in retirement, he had done it again. A familiar voice called out behind him. Braxton! He turned. Amelia Crowley was making her way toward him, still in uniform but looking like she had aged a decade in just a few hours. She exhaled sharply when she reached him, pushing her hair back. I don't think I've ever been on a flight like that, she admitted. Theo chuckled softly. Let's hope you never have to again. Amelia glanced back at the aircraft, where the last few passengers were still being led away. The reports will probably say it was mechanical failure, maybe mention pilot error, but we know the truth. Theo nodded. Yeah, we do. She hesitated. And Captain Wentworth? Theo glanced toward the other side of the tarmac, where Wentworth stood near a group of airline officials. He was talking to someone, his posture stiff, his face drawn. He'll be fine, Theo said simply. He learned what he needed to. Amelia studied Theo for a moment, then nodded. I've worked with a lot of pilots, but I've never seen someone know an aircraft the way you do. Theo shrugged. 40 years in the sky will do that to a man. She smiled. Well, I hope you know you just saved a lot of lives tonight. Theo looked at the passengers in the distance, at the tearful reunions, the relieved phone calls. He didn't need recognition. He never had. But he felt it, a sense of quiet satisfaction. His job had always been about more than just flying. It was about responsibility, about honor. And tonight, even without a uniform, that hadn't changed. Amelia held out her hand. It was an honor, Captain Braxton. Theo took it, shaking firmly. Likewise. With one last glance at the plane behind him, Theo turned and walked toward the terminal, disappearing into the night. Just another man in the crowd. But some names would never be forgotten, and some legacies would always live in the sky. Some heroes don't wear capes, they wear experience. Theodore Braxton didn't need a title or a uniform to prove his worth. He let his knowledge, his instincts, and his unshakable calm do the talking. But this story isn't just about flying. It's about listening, about knowing when to put aside pride and trust the people who see what you don't. So here's a question for you. Have you ever been underestimated, only to prove everyone wrong? Tell us in the comments. We'd love to hear your story. And if you enjoyed this, make sure to subscribe for more gripping, real-world stories that keep you on the edge of your seat. See you in the next one.